convert background noise. Members who are virtually responsible for mute have been Chief of Space Operations. This year's budget request for the Air Force is making large bets on future technology and capabilities, coupled with a bold plan to divest legacy aircraft systems over the next 5 years. And that is a bold plan, and I'm with you on that. And then there is the bow wave of nuclear modernization, which is placing pressure on modernizing the conventional forces. This pressure will continue throughout the current 5-year plan and beyond. This result is that the Air Force is trading near-term capacity for what hopefully will be successful investments and capabilities needed to meet the growing challenge from China. And as President Biden stated this week, this administration is tackling inflation. As the rest of the services, the Department of Air Force is not only not immune to inflation, but I know you gentlemen will be carefully scrutinizing how we can keep costs down in your budget and make sure any inflation is truly inflation to the requests that are being made. The FY23 budget request for Space Force reflects an increase of 30% over the FY22 enacted level. Now, some of this growth is due to the establishment of a new military personnel account, which was previously included in the Air Force budget and was planned to be transferred to the Space Development Agency into Space Force. However, even after adjusting for these transfers, Space Force budget increase is substantial. It's about 18%. With these increases comes more responsibility to spend the funds effectively and efficiently to deliver operational useful capabilities. We would like an update on the progress made in fixing space acquisition and bringing greater discipline to delivering systems on schedule and within the budget. I'd also like to congratulate Mr. Frank Cavelli, who was recently confirmed by the Senate to serve as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, who will also serve as the first ever space acquisition executive. We really welcome his expertise. We wish him well. I'd also like to take a second to thank all the men and women who serve under your commands in the Air Force and Space Force for their daily diligence and hard work and service to our country. I'd also like to note for our members that we will be holding a classified briefing with Secretary Kendall immediately, or as I have to announce, depending upon votes after this hearing. So I'd like to turn to Ranking Member Calvert for his opening remarks. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank each of our witnesses for appearing before us today. We're grateful for your continued service and the service of those under your command. While I look forward to working with each of you to properly fund and equip our airmen and guardsmen, I'm deeply troubled by the administration's weak request for defense. As we look around the world, we see evolving threats, rapid technology changes, more capable adversaries. This requires more resources. Some aspects of the request are encouraging, such as the Air Force prioritization of nuclear modernization. However, I question many other aspects, including the divestment of legacy systems. Again, the Air Force is looking to reduce its force structure, including capable platforms like the F-22, AWACS, and A10. If we're going to proceed with these requests, this committee needs a better understanding of how we can meet the threat environment with a reduced inventory. I'm also pleased to see the Space Force continue to grow its capabilities. As we on the subcommittee know, nearly all our military operations rely on a continued dominance in space. General Raymond, I look forward to hearing how you are working to right-size and shape the force. Throughout this year, we have heard testimony from our geographic combatant commanders. I continue to be extremely concerned that the services and the Air Force in particular are failing to prioritize the warfighting needs of our COCOMs. Like the three of you, I'm an advocate for accelerating change and accepting risk to do so. I'm encouraged by the advanced manufacturing software-first approach you are taking for the next generation systems. However, we cannot overlook urgent warfighting needs to instead divert funding to untested and unproven systems. Hope is not a planning strategy, as my old man used to say, and it certainly will not enable a capable response to any type of conflict that may break out around the globe. Before I close, I must reiterate my concern about how inflation is eating into the DoD's buying power. Though everyone saw it coming, the levels of inflation you are dealing with today are the worst we have seen in decades. Even worse, we do not know what it will be once we pass the FY23 bill. Sharp price increases in fuel, shipping costs, and other consumer goods will have a disastrous effect on your ability to train. I'm a big supporter of the use of augmented and virtual reality training, but pilots need to fly real missions against real pilots. I saw the Air Force just canceled a large contract for adversarial air. I would like you to get me the justification for this and your training replacement plan going forward. As you know, on June 30th, 2020, my constituent, Lieutenant David Schmitz, tragically lost his life during a training mission at Shaw Air Force Base. David's death is a painful reminder of what we risk with limited flight hours and insufficient training. It's clear that more work is necessary to ensure this doesn't happen again, and that our service members don't pay the price for a shrinking budget. It's critical that we work together to provide adequate resources to fully fund weapon systems, operations, and training. Again, thank you again for taking the time to be with us. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Calvert. Ms. Granger, as a ranking full member, the chair of the committee, would you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Chair McCollum. I want to thank each of the witnesses for appearing before us today. I look forward to hearing from you about how the Air Force and Space Force are preparing for both current and future conflicts. I want to begin by restating my serious concern about the inadequacy of the administration's request for defense spending. Inflation is dramatically decreasing the department's buying power, and this budget proposal fails to provide the funds needed to maintain and modernize our military. Looking at this year's request, it's clear that the Air Force wants to retire older systems to fund new ones. This needs to be done in a thoughtful manner. We must be prepared for future conflicts, and we should not do that at the expense of current needs. As the war in Ukraine has shown us, it's critical that the United States has a warfighting inventory that's flexible, capable, and ready. And we must protect our strategic advantages in the air and in the space. As we develop this year's bill, I look forward to working with all of you to ensure that our airmen and guardsmen have the tools they need to fulfill our national defense strategy. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us today, and thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlemen, we have your full testimony in front of us, and members have copies of it made available to them. I'd like to have as much time as I have for members to ask their questions. So I would encourage you, please, to summarize your statement. But I want you to be complete, but as succinct as you can be, also when it comes to responding to our questions. So I'd like to now proceed with the testimony, beginning with Secretary Kindle. Mr. Kindle.
Thank you, Chair McCollum. Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, members of the committee. I'm honored to have General Brown and General Raymond join me in representing the nearly 700,000 airmen and guardians that defend our nation. We are thankful for your consistent support over the years. Speaking in 1940, General Douglas MacArthur said the following: "The history of failure in war can almost be summed up in 2 words: too late. Too late in comprehending the deadly purpose of a potential enemy, too late in realizing the mortal danger, too late in preparedness, too late in uniting all possible forces for resistance, too late in standing with one's friends." I believe MacArthur made this comment after France failed to Nazi Germany's aggression, but before the attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into a war in Asia, a time that in some ways may be analogous to our own. What my colleagues and I are trying to do, and what we need your help with, is to ensure that America's air and space forces are never too late in meeting our pacing challenge, which is China. We're also concerned about the now obvious and acute threat of Russian aggression. I'd like to offer the committee a briefing that we've been giving on the Hill that details the threat that China poses in more completely. I'll be summarizing that in our classified session later today. That briefing lays out China's efforts to develop and field forces that can defeat the United States' ability to project power in the Western Pacific. China is also significantly increasing its nuclear weapon inventory and working to field long-range strike capabilities that put our homeland at risk. Today, we'll say more about how the Department of the Air Force is responding to that threat through our fiscal year 23 budget and through future budgets. Our budget submission provides a balance between the capabilities we need today and investments in the transformation required to address emerging threats. With the requested budget, the Air and Space Forces will be able to support our combatant commanders in the continuing campaigns that demonstrate our resolve, support and encourage our allies and partners around the world. Simultaneously, our fiscal year 23 budget represents a significant early step in the transformation of the Air and Space Forces to the capabilities needed to provide enduring advantage. An important feature of our budget request is a substantial increase in research and development funding. This investment is a down payment on production and sustainment investments and hard choices that are yet to come. We're comfortable with the balance struck in the budget submission. We also want to ensure the committee understands that hard choices do lie ahead at any budget level. In this request, we're asking for divestiture of equipment that is beyond its service life, too expensive to sustain, and not effective against the pacing challenge. These divestments are necessary to provide the resources required to transform the Department of the Air Force to support integrated deterrence. We appreciate the committee's support for the divestitures we requested last year, and we ask for your support for those we are requesting this year and those in the future. Change is hard, but losing is unacceptable, and we cannot afford to be too late. The work we have ongoing in the Department of the Air Force to define the necessary transformation is focused on 7 operational imperatives, each of which is associated with some aspect of our ability to project power. As of today, there should be no doubt that great power acts of aggression do occur, and equally no doubt of how devastating they can be for the victims of that aggression and for the global community. First, if the Space Force is to fulfill its mission of enabling and protecting the joint force, we must pivot to transformational space architectures and systems. Fiscal year 23, we are asking for funding to begin the transformation to resilient missile warning and tracking and to resilient communications networks. Second, we must integrate and efficiently employ air and space forces as part of a highly lethal joint force through an advanced battle management system, or ABMS. This budget continues funding for the early increments of ABMS and the ongoing work that will define additional investments that the department needs to cost-effectively modernize our command and control, communications, and battle management networks. Third, to defeat aggression, we must have the ability to hold large numbers of air and surface targets at risk in a time-compressed scenario. This budget funds the E-7 Wedgetail as an interim AWACS replacement. Fourth, our control of the air is being challenged, and we must proceed to an affordable next-generation air dominance family of systems. Fifth, we must have a resilient forward basing for our tactical air forces. This budget continues funding for agile combat employment in both the Indo-Pacific and European regions. Six, we must ensure the long-term viability and cost-effectiveness of our global strike capability. Within this budget, the B-21 enters production. Finally, the Department of the Air Force must be fully ready to transition to a wartime posture against a peer competitor. Members of the committee, I look forward to your support as we work to ensure that America's air and space forces are never too late. One team, one fight. We welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. And now, General Brown, please proceed.
Good morning, Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, and Ranking Member Granger. and distinguished members of this committee. It's an honor to appear before you and represent the 689,000 total Force Airmen serving today. I want to thank you for your continued support to our airmen and their families. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today with Secretary Kendall and General Raymond to testify on the FY 2030 budget submission, a budget that continues to accelerate the Air Force's rate of change to address the security challenges articulated in the National Defense Strategy, a budget that continues to build on the successes of FY 22. The world looks to the United States Air Force as a leading example. Airmen make air power look easy, but it's anything but. A world-class Air Force requires world-class airmen that are organized, trained, and equipped to remain the world's most respected Air Force. But if we do not continue to transform, this may no longer be the case. We must continue to communicate and collaborate with this committee and key stakeholders so we can accelerate change. Last year's budget communicated the Air Force the nation needs for 2030 and beyond. Our message has not changed for fiscal year 23, and it won't change in future budget submissions. We must modernize to counter strategic competitors. The PRC remains our pacing challenge, and Russia remains an acute threat. So we must balance between the demands of today and requirements for tomorrow. Failure to do so puts our ability to execute the National Defense Strategy at risk. It puts soldiers, sailors, Marines, Guardians, and airmen, along with our allies and partners, at risk. And it puts our ability to place air power anytime, anywhere, at risk. The only way our Air Force and the nation will be successful balancing risk between today and tomorrow is if we collaborate. In fact, collaboration is the critical word in Accelerate, Change, or Lose. We are beginning to see successes of our collaboration efforts towards transition to the future. This year's budget brought substantial increases to research and development. It's focused on placing meaningful military capability into the hands of our airmen. Investment in systems and concepts that allow our Air Force to penetrate and dominate in any scenario. Just as important as our investments, we have been successful in beginning to divest systems that are increasingly irrelevant against today's and tomorrow's threats. We did not do this alone. The support of Congress is much appreciated. Accelerating change is impetus behind the Department of the Air Force's operational imperatives. This means moving with a sense of urgency and doing so in the right direction. This year's National Defense Strategy provides us the needed direction. And when you combine the operational imperatives and the National Defense Strategy, you see this year's budget is in alignment with what our nation demands of our Air Force. The Air Force we are building is critical to integrated deterrence, campaigning, and building enduring advantages. Because nuclear deterrence is the backstop of integrated deterrence, this year's budget ensures our nuclear portfolios are fully funded. Current events are emblematic of how our Air Force is campaigning. We deployed Air Force assets within days, shared vital information, and increased interoperability with our allies and partners. Finally, the Air Force invested in enduring advantages that allow us to defend the homeland, project our power globally, and operate as a joint, allied, and partnered force. More than anyone, I want tomorrow's airmen to be ready to respond when our nation calls. This includes investing in programs that allow all of our airmen and their families to reach their full potential. As the United States Air Force celebrates its 75th anniversary this year, we are committed to remaining the world-class Air Force America can be proud of. Current events demonstrate the world is growing more complex and uncertain, but I am certain we will need air power anytime, anywhere. I'm certain this year's budget is another step towards the transformation of the Air Force. I am certain there's still more work to be done. Therefore, we must continue to communicate, collaborate, so we can accelerate change. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. General Raymond, please proceed.
Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, Ranking Member Granger, and distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before you today with Secretary Kendall and General Brown. On behalf of the almost 14,000 Guardians stationed around the world, let me begin by thanking each of you for your continued leadership and your strong support of our Guardians and their families. As we testify before you today, we find ourselves at a strategic inflection point where we are faced with an acute threat from Russia and a pacing challenge from China. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has showcased the importance of space to all instruments of national power. Information derived from space, including commercial imagery, has been instrumental in dominating the information environment, communicating with forces, and detecting missile threats. It is clear that the character of war has changed, and space is foundational to that change. However, Russia's recent direct ascent anti-satellite missile test last November is just the latest evidence of efforts to deny our nation the advantages that space provides. Just as concerning, our pacing challenge, China, is integrating space into their military operations to detect, track, target, and strike the joint force, putting our sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines and Guardians on the ground, in the air, and on sea at high risk. We cannot allow potential adversaries to gain an unchallenged ability to conduct space-enabled attacks. Our joint forces will remain at risk until we can complete the transformation to a resilient space architecture and protect the joint force from space-enabled attacks. This is critical to supporting all aspects of the National Defense Strategy, integrated deterrence, campaigning, and building enduring advantage. To remain the world's leader in space, this President's budget request prioritizes space and invests $24.5 billion to ensure our assured access to and freedom to maneuver in space. The largest share is research, development, testing, and evaluation funding, almost $16 billion to modernize our forces, a portion of which will begin the pivot to a more resilient and mission-capable missile warning and missile tracking force design. Notably, this includes funding for the Space Development Agency, which is included in the Space Force budget for the first time this year. In contrast to legacy approaches, this architecture will be built to survive and degrade gracefully under attack, help manage escalation, and be rapidly reconstituted. This transformation will also allow us to capitalize more fully on two of our national advantages: our commercial industry and our allies and partners. To increase readiness, we are funding operational test and training infrastructure. This ensures that we can get the right capability on orbit and in the hands of operators trained and operating in a contested domain. Robust test and training capabilities are also critical to fielding our next generation systems. Other key investments include increased funding for weapon system sustainment and a more resilient global positioning system and next generation satellite communications. Finally, and most importantly, we invest in our Guardians and their families. Over the past 2 years, we have overhauled how we recruit, assess, train, develop, promote, and employ, and take care of Guardians. Resilient space power isn't just about satellites, it's also about Guardians. This is one of the reasons why we are seeking the integration of active duty and reserve forces into a single hybrid component structure. This space component is central to our human capital plan and will allow us to best align our full-time and part-time members. This is our #1 legislative proposal, and we look forward to working with this committee to implement this bold and transformational approach. As Secretary Kendall has mentioned, change is hard and losing is unacceptable. The transformation we're beginning now is essential to protecting the joint force and for the security of space. Thank you again for your leadership and support of our Space Force. It's an honor to appear before you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all. For members who have just come in, we are going to adhere to the 5-minute rule, as we don't know when votes are going to be called for all of us asking questions today. Gentlemen, as you know, delivering space systems on time and within budget has been a challenge for quite some time. Examples: GPS ground control segment was more than 6 years late and 70% over budget. GPS handsets for warfighters are years behind schedule, and the current missile warning system was delivered 9 years late and $15 billion over budget. So fixing acquisition is one of the primary reasons why a Space Force was created. So Secretary Kendall, you and I are going to have an opportunity to talk later today, so I'm going to focus on Space Force. We need to make sure the overall Space Force 5-year budget is executable and it's affordable. The next 5-year budget estimate is basically flat, rising a bit in 2024 before falling below the 2023 proposed budget level. Secretary Kendall and General Brown, do you feel that the FY23 request and then the out-year projections reflect what will actually take to deliver successful acquisitions and programs that you're aware of over the next few years? And if so, what programs could possibly be put at risk? Does Space Force believe it can really carry out its mission with that flat budget, reprioritizing current activities? And if so, what would you prioritize? Secretary Kendall and then General Raymond.
Chairman Goldman, it's a great question. I think it's a very perceptive one. The transformation I talked about and the difficult choices that lie ahead are related to what you just asked me. We are starting the transformation of our capabilities in space with the missile warning architecture and the communications architectures that we're investing in 23. We're also working to define our other needs, both to provide the services that enable the joint force from space and also to protect the joint force from possible attack based on targeting by our enemies from space. We have a lot of work still to do there, but we're off to, I think, a very solid start. I do not anticipate that future budgets will remain flat or go down for the Space Force, quite the opposite. But we still have to define our requirements. We have to make sure that the programs we put in place, as you indicated, are structured for success so that we don't have massive schedule and cost overruns. We all want to avoid that. There are opportunities through emerging technologies and through commercial best practices that I think will make that possible. But we're going to still have to be disciplined, and we're going to have to be smart about how we invest in space. So I think that's the picture that we see coming. Okay, at this point, I think the 23 budget does a good start, gives us a good start towards those types of architectures, and gives us the resources we need to decide what next steps we need to take.
Yes, ma'am, I agree wholeheartedly with Secretary Kendall. We still have work to do. We've got a great force design. It's united the department around this force design. Now we have to acquire it. If we acquire this force design the same way we do legacy systems, it would be unaffordable. We have to change the way we do business. Central to that is the work that we've done to modernize our acquisition system. You'd mentioned the current constellation and the overruns it had. The current program, Next Gen Geo, is on schedule. It's met every performance parameter. It's met all of its key performance parameters. It completed its critical design review, and it's currently 25 months ahead of the average time it takes from start to launch of a program. So we are keeping laser focus on this to make sure that we can deliver on a cost and time that's critical to our nation.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I'm impressed with your enthusiasm that you're going to be on time, on target, on budget. But I do have some concerns, especially as light as both the ranking member and I brought up inflation. Inflation is something that wasn't fully, I'm sure, baked into this budget, but inflation in general doesn't mean an across-the-board increase, and I appreciate your due diligence in making sure that when we have contracts or concerns about inflation, that we are counting the right things in the right basket for inflation and not just taking across-the-board increases. So we will follow up with some more questions for the record, but for right now, I thank you. And members, I am yielding back time. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. General Brown, you're aware of my disagreement with the Air Force views on the future of the MQ-9 Reaper. It seems that when you do not want to keep an aircraft in your inventory, you're labeling it not survivable, without clearly describing what it means and requesting to divest it. I understand that if we are in a kinetic war with China, that the MQ-9 will not be able to collect ISR on adversarial territory. But most of the world is uncontested airspace, and COCOMs in these areas desperately need more ISR. Every single combatant commander I talk to wants more ISR, and specifically the MQ-9. I have 4 questions I'd like you to answer. 1, can you put more context and specifics into the term survivability? 2, are we meeting our geographic combatant commanders' operational needs? And 3, the Air Force seems to have no problem justifying the purchase of 4th-gen manned fighter aircraft at a higher cost than the more survivable 5th-gen, yet it refuses to see any value in a 4th-gen unmanned affordable ISR platform. I can see value in a mix of the 4th and 5th generation platforms, so how do you explain the Air Force's differing positions on these platforms? And finally, if the Air Force position is to maintain the current fleet until 2030s and then retire the MQ-9s, when will its replacement be prototype, tested, and then fielded? So I'll leave the rest of the time to answer that.
I appreciate the question, Representative Cowart. Let me put all of it into context. There's a mix of capabilities that we are bringing forward, and specific to the MQ-9 and to the ISR, and really more broadly across the Air Force. The Air Force is in high demand from our combatant commanders, and I speak to them quite often. As we look at the MQ-9s in this particular budget, there are 100 of them that will actually get transferred to an intergovernment transfer, but there'll be no impact to the combatant commanders on MQ-9. No impact to the combatant commanders. We'll maintain the number of combat lines, and the same thing with our
why do they disagree with that? Why is that?
I know they're demanding customers. But we are providing them the ISR that we do have. And this is where, again, the Air Force is in high demand. As far as their needs, there's a balance of needs between what the combat commands, not only from MQ-9s, but the other platforms. And to put the survivability piece in context, I can talk to you more in the classified session on the specifics of these platforms. So there will be a mix of the connected, survival, persistent with the MQ-9s. And so we will continue to have MQ-9s in our inventory. Versus the 4th and 5th gen, just like the mix on our fighter fleet between 4th and 5th gen, we will have the same kind of mix with our ISR platforms. And you'll have platforms like the MQ-9 and some of our other big wing ISR with the other classified programs we'll have more chance to talk about in the classified session. And so there is a balance between the current fleet that we have today and the fleet we'll have to have in the future. And we have to balance it against the threat. And the threat we've been up against for the past 30 years, particularly in the Middle East, has been very permissive. The threats that we face in the future and we're facing today are less permissive, and which is why we have to have a mix of capability to operate both in that permissive environment and the less permissive environment that we expect to see from our growing adversaries, particularly the People's Republic of China.
Well, I would point out that not just the Middle East is permissive, but Africa is permissive, South America is permissive. About 90% of the globe is. So when we take a look at the cost differential between the so-called survivable ISR versus what you define as not survivable is significant. So we need to look at that and determine whether or not that risk is really worth it, both in the short term and the long term. So I look forward to working with you on that. But as you know, I disagree with your basic premise on this.
And this is an area where we don't do this just blindly. Part of this is that we do levels of analysis to go through this to make sure we get to the best of our ability, get the right mix. But I'm very happy to work with you and the rest of the committee and be able to talk to you in more detail about our approach, particularly as we look at we get into our classified session.
Just one last point. I just want to point out, as you know, the Marine Corps is buying more for Indo-PACOM. So obviously they believe that they can't count on the Air Force to provide that service, which is really frustrating to me because in the beginning of this thing, the Air Force was going to run all the ISR, and the CIA had to do it, and the Army had to do it, and then now the Marine Corps is going to do it. And it should have been, quite frankly, all under one umbrella of the United States Air Force, but obviously that genie is out of the bottle. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Calvert. Mr. Ruthensberger. You're recognized.
General Raymond, in recent years, the Space Development Agency, SDA, has accelerated its pursuit of low Earth orbit constellations. I believe that the proliferation of a LEO satellite constellation is critical to our nation's future efforts in data communication, missile defense, projectile navigation, and battlefield operations, and more. Now, as Space Force fully absorbs SDA in fiscal year 2023, how does your budget ensure that we maintain the authorities and efficiencies we need at SDA to remain on track for their important programs?
Thank you for the question, sir. SDA, I too believe that proliferation of a low Earth orbit satellite constellation is critical. The cornerstone of our budget is exactly that. The Space Development Agency has helped inform that. They've been working side by side with us as we bring SDA in. Their capabilities, their prototypes are included in this. The way Secretary Kendall has worked with R&E, the parent of SDA today, is that we've already treated them like they're part of our team, or we're already integrating them. And as we're going to bring them in, we want to bring them in as they are, to give them the flexibility to be able to operate as they are, and then we're going to provide support to make sure that they stay lean and efficient and go fast.
Okay. Secretary Kendall, now that we are more than 2 years in, how do you assess the Department of Air Force's management of building and integrating the Space Force? And what hard budget decisions did you have to make in FY23 to ensure we maintain our advantage in the space domain? I mean, I realize it's a broad question, but give it a shot.
I think overall, I'm very happy with what I inherited as I came into office about a year ago. I think General Raymond and his team have done a fantastic job. They have really laid out a path forward to acquire resilient capabilities, and they're also dealing with what we need to do to protect the joint force from targeting from space by our adversaries. So we're on the right track, and we've made some good steps in the right direction, but there's an enormous amount of work still to be done. We have to define the rest of the architectures that we're going to need for space services, and we have a number of things underway that we'll talk about in the classified form that are important as well. One of the key things we need to do is work closely with the intelligence community to ensure that the ISR, which came up earlier in the hearing, that we need from space is provided effectively from space. The intelligence community has an intelligence mission, but it also understands that it needs to support operational forces. And we're working in close collaboration with the intelligence community to define requirements that meet both of our needs and then systems that will do that as well. So that's a work in progress, and that's one of the things that we'll be addressing in the budget and future submissions.
Yeah, there was a lot of debate about that, whether we should do it, whether we shouldn't do it. There are a lot of different opinions, but we've done it, and we need to stand behind it. And we need to
We, the
work
Space
very
Force?
closely with you. Yes.
Absolutely,
We
Congressman.
need to stand behind it, whatever the thoughts
We're
were.
fully committed to making it a success.
And move forward, and this committee feels the same way, I think. You're back.
I think we all want Space Force to be a huge success. We're next going to hear from Ms. Granger and then Mr. Kilmer.
The commander of the U.S. European Command testified about the incredible capabilities of the F-35 deployed in the region. However, the budget request reduced the number of F-35s the Air Force wants to buy. Secretary Kendall, can you please explain the reduced number in your request and if the Air Force is still committed to the F-35 and to what degree?
Congressman Granger, I'll answer the second part first. Absolutely committed to the F-35. It's a cornerstone of our fighter fleet and will be for many years to come. And people have asked me if we're committed to the program. We're 15 years into production, and I expect we will be buying it for another 15 years. The reduction we took this year, and we'll probably extend it to next year, was based on a number of factors. There were a number of things we need to do in the TAC-Air portfolio. One of them was to buy out the remaining number of inventory of F-15EXs that we need for the capabilities that the F-15EX would provide. We want to increase the funding for the next generation of air dominance, which will be the follow-on to the F-22. We have some other programs we need to move forward as well. We also are very interested in insistent on getting the Block 4 capabilities for F-35. And the contractor's been late in delivering them so far, so we want to see evidence that he'll be able to accomplish that before we increase the production. So that was a major factor as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Gentlewoman yielding back, or does the gentlewoman have another question? Mr. Kilmer.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for being with us. I was hoping to quickly cover two topics. Secretary Kendall, as you know, Air Mobility Command is the critical backbone of our nation's response to global threats. Air refueling is a key part of Mobility Command's operations. We are fortunate to have both the 92nd Air Refueling Wing and the Air National Guard's 141st Air Refueling Wing at Fairchild Air Force Base on the other side of my state in Spokane. Despite its critical role, the 141st Air Refueling Wing still operates as a classic associate unit without KC-135s. As the Air Force brings more KC-46s into service, is the Air Force exploring options to realign KC-135s to units like the 141st to provide added capability for the Air Force?
We are in the process of assessing where KC-46, 146 will be based for the remainder of the fleet that we currently have, we project. We are constantly looking at the basing for cost of force, basically. One of the things that we do pay attention to, of course, is that there's an enormous amount of political interest in retaining capability. One of the things we're asking people to look at is that flying capability isn't always the best thing for you to have. There are other capabilities such as cyber and battle management capabilities that we need as well. A lot of our older aircraft are going to be retired. KC-135 has served us very well, but I was on one recently, and that is a very old airplane. We will be bringing down in our Crest and going through the FIDIP the total number of tankers modestly. It's a request we have of the committee. But we are going to recapitalize that fleet, and we are going to continue to do that. Tankers are an incredibly important part of our force structure, but they're not the only thing that's important. We have to balance an awful lot of competing things as we do our planning for the future.
The other thing I wanted to quickly touch on was just housing. I know that you're dealing with issues related to recruitment and retention of service members. We've seen across the country a big spike in the cost of single-family homes. In my neck of the woods, it's gone up 24% from the last year. Rent's up about 19% since the beginning of the pandemic. And that affects everybody, but particularly service members, since unlike civilians, they can't really choose where they live and have to deal with an increasingly competitive housing market. I applaud the DOD for increasing the basic allowance for housing at the beginning of this year, but it's clearly not enough. I was hoping you could talk about what's being done to ensure that service members can actually afford rent or purchase a house at their new duty station, and whether you're exploring any ways to increase on-base housing options as well.
We're looking at all sorts of ways to address this. What's happened, of course, as you indicated, is that the cost of housing has gone up fairly dramatically and fairly quickly. So we have, Secretary Austin is personally very concerned about this, and we've had a number of conversations about it. We are taking steps to, in some places, increase basic allowance for housing, out of cycle, if you will.
Yeah.
And we need the support of the committee as we go forward, particularly as inflation continues, making adjustments even at interim periods, not just on an annual basis. So it's something we're tracking very carefully. We are trying to make sure that we maintain the quality of our onboard housing, on-base housing as well. That's an important thing for us, too.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll yield back.
Thank you, members, for being so considerate of everyone. Mr. Cole and then Ms. Kilpatrick.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, great to have you. I want to begin by just associating myself with the remarks of the ranking member, both the full committee and the subcommittee, about these concerns about divestiture and about the overall size of the budget. Just frankly, with all due respect, too low in the kind of world that we're living in today. And I suspect that'll be something the full committee and certainly the subcommittee will struggle with going forward. An example of this, or one of my concerns, is number one, I want to begin to compliment you. Thank you for beginning to replace our airborne early warning and control systems. They're way out of date, they're old, they're aging. But I'm a little worried about the speed with which you're retiring E3s. And these are, again, we have had this fight during the Obama years, and I remember talking to the chief then. He said, look, I'm having to cannibalize planes I don't want to give up to keep planes flying that I need. I understand that dilemma. We should never put you in that dilemma, but I think you're in it again right now. These are, again, high-demand assets from combatant commander standpoint. So give me an idea of how you're balancing this off, retiring them, because I'm very worried at the end we'll retire capabilities that we need right now, not have them when we need them right now, and then frankly probably not have as much on the other side of this as we would like to have.
Thank you, Congressman. We have a gap today in airborne early warning capability. Current AWACSs are not where they need to be to deal with the threats that we're currently facing. And it's very difficult to maintain them. Their availability rate is less than 50%. So what we hope to do by retiring 15 this year is to be able to increase the availability of the balance. A couple of ways we can do that. We transfer people over to those aircraft to do maintenance on them, and we also have parts available from the aircraft that we're retiring. What we need to do is to accelerate the capability that we really need, which in the interim is the E7, and get that as quickly as possible. There are limited possibilities to do that. It takes about 2 years to get the new airplanes that we're going to be modifying, and then another 2 years roughly to modify them. We are looking at creative ways to try to accelerate that process and to reduce the risk in it. And we're all very aware of this as an important priority for the Air Force. So we're trying to do everything we can to move as quickly.
Well, I appreciate that, but this is not like the KC-135 where there's hundreds of them. 15 out of 32, and then say we're going to have capability 4 years out is really high risk. I mean, you're going to have a period of time there where you just simply don't have the aircraft that you need for early warning and control.
The problem is we don't have the aircraft we need today. The AWACSs that we have today are not adequate for the threats.
I totally agree. I've been making this argument for years. So again, I praise you for that. I think you're right to be bringing on new capability. What I worry about is losing over the next 4 years. And 4 years is a long time. And I've watched us, again, I'd rather replace capability as it comes on, retire aircraft. But this idea of retiring this many now and hoping that we'll have what we need in 4 years is a big risk to me, and one that I think is not wise to take. So, and I don't, again, we're putting you in that spot, in my view, by not giving you the budget that you need to add capabilities, or replace capabilities in a timely fashion. But anyway, that's, I see, just be honest with you, I see that throughout the budget. And again, I put the blame for that on us, not on you. We haven't, we've stretched some of these platforms way too long. You're exactly right on things like the KC-135 or things like the B-3s. We just should have done this a long time ago, but retiring them too quickly now, I think, is a risk. And I'd rather us give you more resources and have you bring on capabilities and sort of retire as you bring on, as opposed to have a period where we drop from 32 planes down to 17 or so. I mean, that's just, I don't see how you could meet the needs that you have from your combatant commanders if we made that kind of decision. And I suspect we see that again in area after area. I think that's really where the ranking member was at, her concerns on the F-35. Same thing. I don't have a lot of time, and I want to follow the good example set by others, Madam Chair, so I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Kilpatrick, then followed by Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. Secretary Kendall and General Brown, as you are well aware, my district is home to the largest concentration of A-10 aircraft in the world, with 89 based at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. These uniquely capable aircraft have been called upon time and time again to deliver incredibly effective close air support in a way that no other platform has been able to do, saving countless Allied lives in the process. The budget request proposes a divestment of the fleet to 260 airframes, but the budget documents make clear that the Air Force only intends on procuring wing replacement kits for a fleet size of no more than 218 aircraft. You both have indicated that you do not believe there will be many viable mission sets for the A-10 in the near future. This is something we have heard from the Air Force for more than a decade, and yet the A-10 continued to be called upon. The security situation in Ukraine, which is largely a mission the A-10 was designed for, by the way, demonstrates that the world is an incredibly dangerous and unpredictable place. I was glad to read this week that A-10s are deploying to Eastern Europe to support the Army's swift response exercise, underscoring the jet's utility there. I was also glad to read this week that the Air Force has determined that the A-10, and in particular, its unique gun system, is capable of destroying even the most modern armor in contested environments, with the Air Force's own press release stating, quote, "The A-10 is well suited for agile combat employment roles, and this test proves the A-10 can continue to deliver massive rapid firepower with devastating effects on enemy vehicles in a contested environment," end quote. Clearly, there remains a mission for the A-10 beyond counterinsurgency. So my question for Secretary Kendall and General Brown, do you agree that new wing sets must be procured in order to keep these aircraft flying into the 2030s?
Mr. Secretary, I'm going to give you an additional 30 seconds beyond what you have to answer that, and then we'll go to the next question.
Our plan with the A-10 this year is to remove 21 aircraft and replace them with F-16s in Indiana. So a relatively modest request this year. Over time, though, we do intend to divest the A-10s. We don't want to re-wing airplanes that we intend to divest in the not-too-distant future. I'm an Army officer, former Army officer, and I'm a big proponent of close air support, and I've been a fan of the A-10 for almost my entire career. The problem is that it's an old aircraft that was designed for an environment that is not the one that we're most concerned about now. It was designed to be very survivable against ground fire in particular. It is not survivable against modern threats. And when we look at our pacing challenges, we really have to get on to our next generations of capability. And unfortunately, A-10 is not a cost-effective platform in that environment. Let me ask General Brown to say a little bit more about that.
The key part for the A-10 is to be able to operate in an area that has air superiority, and that's an area that when we think about the A-10, we've got to actually be able to take down the threat before it becomes there. And I can just tell you from practical experience, when I was the Air Component Commander at United States Central Command, when the Russians came into Syria, we had to move the operations for the A-10 because they could not protect themselves from the fighter aircraft above. And so there's aspects of really concerning the threat that drives the reason why we're making a move away from the A-10 into a portfolio of fighter capability. It's multi-role. And as I work with our combatant commanders and talk to them, I know they're exercising in EUCOM right now, but the aspect of what they want on a recurring basis is this multi-role capability, particularly even at CENTCOM today, as I've talked to the current new CENTCOM commander. So it's a transition to a future portfolio capability that is designed for the threats that we expect to see, we see today, and threats we expect to see in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the witnesses. And Madam Chair, I yield back. My time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Womack. And then Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Generals, thank you for your service to our great country and the work that you're doing presently. To the distinguished Secretary, I want you to know that you are not alone that first week in November, even though you're situated between two Air Force generals. That when you try to channel that inner Black Knight loyalty, I'll be with you. I'll have your back.
Thank you, Congressman.
Football aside, I'd like to just ask a question about the bridge tanker program. I know it's a program you're tracking closely, one you've been asked about in your other hearings on the Hill. I know the Air Force has not determined the requirements yet for this bridge tanker. Can you share with us when you expect the requirements to be finalized and what AMC is looking at in developing these requirements, a critical piece of our national defense strategy?
Thank you, Congressman. We're looking at what our operational needs will be going forward and what the cost effectiveness would be of various options. Key to that is what we need operationally first, right? And Air Mobility Command is looking at that. They're evaluating what class of tanker in terms of capacity and range and so on will be the best in the mix as we go forward. At one time, it looked as if we would be moving towards a platform that was significantly different than the KC-46. That is not at all clear at this point. So what I've been trying to be very clear with people about the fact that the likelihood of a competition has diminished as we've gotten to understand the requirements better. But we're not through with that process yet. We should be making a decision later this calendar year on exactly what the path forward will be. But I want to be as transparent as possible about where the situation is. There is no decision at this point in time, though.
I share some of the same concerns that my colleague from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, had raised, particularly where it concerns the E3 AWACS program. But generally speaking, I have concerns about aircraft readiness. And when you look across the spectrum of our aerial platforms, mission-capable rates are a big concern of mine, and I know they're a big concern to the force as a whole. And ironically enough, I might be wrong, but I think the A-10 probably has a mission-capable rate that's higher than a lot of the other platforms. But I do support the divestiture targets that you're looking at for terms of efficiency and need, and to be able to free up resources to address some of our other needs. How does that FY23 budget process address this issue, and what are your overall goals and expectations for some of these numbers moving forward?
We're working to increase and improve the availability of our aircraft. And I talked about balance in my opening statement. We're trying to balance current capabilities, which is a function of what resources we put into that versus resources we put into other things that are important to us. And I think we've struck a reasonable balance. We're trying to meet the needs of our combatant commanders around the world. We're trying to focus in particular on the pacing challenge in the Indo-Pacific region, but also with developments in Europe, we're having to basically make sure that we're as capable there as we can be, as well as support ongoing requirements in other places. So we look at all that. We try to be sure that we can maintain that forward presence and capability, as well as the surge capability if it might be needed. At the same time, we're, of course, investing in the future. So we think we've got the balance about in the right place at this point in time, but we're always looking for ways to improvement. Let me ask General Brown to add a few words to that.
Very much so, and that's the analysis we do, and we do a number of, what I really focus on is the analysis to look at what we project the threat to be, but also how we balance doing what the combatant commanders need. And as I talk to combatant commanders and talk in the building, I talk about balancing risk over time. It's the risk that we take today with the combatant commanders as you look to the future, the risk we would take in the future. And so how do you balance that so we don't buy down all our risk here today, and then actually when we get to a future, we have a lot more risk. And so that's part of the conversation we're having as we move forward.
Well, I share the same concerns Mr. Cole broached. Look, this problem is on you, and it's really from us, that I do believe that we need to increase the spending so that we can buy down some of that risk. And so that will be an effort, I think, that a lot of us will continue to fight going forward. But I do appreciate the service to your great country, and thank you so much, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. Ms. Capter, and then Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. Gentlemen, thank you for your great service to our country. Secretary Kendall, I wanted to just ask you a question in terms of the current conflict in Europe with Russia's war on Ukraine. Has the Air Force, both in terms of regular as well as Guard, been integrated in a manner that allows excess space that may exist on cargo flights that are going over to Europe anyway, be made available to humanitarian groups in our country that are attempting to get goods there? For example, Rotary. There are many humanitarian groups, church groups, hospitals, and so forth. It's so expensive by air. Have you been asked to identify flights that are going over anyway that might take goods into some of our allies that then assure that it gets into Ukraine?
Representative Capter, I'm not aware of that. We can check and take that for the record. General Brown, maybe. Our activities have largely been about supporting the conflict and providing things that, as you're aware, the President has provided a lot of aid to Ukraine. Yes. The Defense Department has been very active in providing that and in moving it over to Europe. So we've had a lot of flights that are going for that purpose. I'm not aware to the extent to which there may be additional capacity that wasn't used. It could be used for the purpose you described, but it sounds like a reasonable thing for us to be doing. I'd have to take it for the record to see what's been done or what could be done there.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yes.
Very much, the Secretary. I'm not aware of any requests so far, but we're willing to take a hard look at that and see where we can assist.
There are certain assets sitting on the ground all over this country, and I appreciate your interest in looking at that. If someone could get back to me at some point, I'd be very grateful for that. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask General Raymond, you have to stand up something brand new. That's really hard. And I wanted to ask you, as you look at where the Space Force is currently arrayed across the country, both in terms of physical space as well as human infrastructure, is it largely centered on one of the coasts? Is it like East Coast? Is it arrayed across the country? Is there anything in the Great Lakes? Could you give us a sense of what that looks like across our country? Not specific locations, but just in general.
Thank you. And I'm privileged to stand up the Space Force, and I have a great team, and I'm proud of that team. Largely, with space being a global domain, you have to have capabilities around the globe to be able to operate. In CONUS, we operate in about 6 big hubs from California to the East Coast. We've got California, Colorado, a couple different places in Colorado, Florida, New Mexico are some of the big hubs. And then we have smaller sites stationed in Northern California, Cape Cod, North Dakota, Thule, Greenland, Clear, Alaska. So we're a global, in Europe, so we're a global enterprise. Again, in very small numbers, 8,400 active duty folks by the end of this year, but it's a global presence.
Well, I would just like to say, in terms of Ohio, the home of John Glenn and Neil Armstrong, the Great Lakes always seems to get left out. And I'm just making a plea. I can't make anything happen in this city. I've tried for a long time. But just pay attention to the Great Lakes. Look at the number of enlistments that come from our region for each of you. And I know about Right Pat, you know, but I'm just saying, as we move forward, don't forget us. You don't have to respond.
I won't forget you. And we do rely heavily on the folks at Right Pat. We have Guardians stationed at Right Pat as well. One of the big benefits that we've received, quantifiable benefits that we've received in standing up the Space Force, is our ability to attract talent. We have more people knocking on our door from around the world, around the country, than we can take. And so we will make sure we keep a close eye on and getting the right talent in the force.
Thank you very, very much. And I have two other items very briefly. I'm wondering, in terms of the reduction in request for F-35s, I'm privileged to represent the 180th Fighter Wing, which is a National Guard unit that is always war-ready in Toledo, Ohio. And I'm just wondering whether or not that unit is still on the list for consideration for F-35s. It was in the past, in view of the fact that you are suggesting that the procurement be reduced.
Ms. Capter, do you want to do your other questions so they can take it for the record?
Yes, and also is Plumbrook Research Station in Ohio on your list of potential sites for hypersonic missile activities?
Thank you, Ms.
We'll take those for the record.
Thank you, Ms. Capter.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Carter and then Mr. Christ.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Secretary Kendall, since World War II, midway through it, we've dominated airspace in our wars throughout the history of the United States. We, political leaders and ordinary citizens, are very fully aware of the progress going on in China. In your opinion, the fight tonight and in the future as we go through these process changes, we're going to be able to dominate airspace so that we can win, fight and win in the fight tonight.
No potential adversary of the United States should doubt for a moment the capability or the resolve of the United States or the capacity of the United States Air Force to do what it would be asked to do. We have the most formidable fighting machine on the planet, but we are being challenged, and we are being challenged very effectively. The threat briefing that I talked about earlier lays out the ways in which we're being challenged. So we have to move to a next generation of capabilities as quickly as we can. There's no doubt about that. The Chinese have been watching the American way of projecting power since the first Gulf War 30 years ago. And they spent the last 20 or 30 years investing in things designed to defeat the United States. So we have to respond to that. And as General Brown has said, you know, we have to accelerate change or we will lose. And that's an exactly accurate statement. And that's what we're trying to do with the budget in '23 is to affect some of that change. CQ, do you want to add anything?
The one other thing I would also add to that is the quality of our airmen. It's not only the equipment we put in their hands, but it's the hard work that they do day in and day out to ensure we're able to do what the nation's asked us to do. And I'm very confident that we can do that. But by the same token, though, I do not want to put ourselves in a position where we have any doubt. And this is why we want to make that transition to the future.
Well, as we look at what's going on in the world, and we're seeing a lot of people are commenting based on what happens in Ukraine is going to have an influence on whether China decides to invade Taiwan, which will put that fight over in the Pacific. And being in charge of helping out the heavy army, that's my job. We got to dominate the airspace for our armor to be effective. And we got armor fighters here, and they know that. And therefore, I'm worried about the drawdown. That's the one I'm thinking. I think that's the first question that Mr. Calvert asked. As we draw down, and I read through that next question that y'all submitted, and it looked like you were just taking down an awful lot of platforms in hopes that we get to the future quickly. But our history is we don't. I would say, we'll just take a look at the F-35, how long it took to get it there. And so there's many, many other platforms. Historically, we are bureaucratically bogged down in our forces by some of the ways we procure and go forward. And if we're going to draw down in anticipation of being able to dominate in the future, it brings great concern to me. So I'm depending on you, that question is going to stand for the next 5 or 6 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Mr. Christ, and then Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. Mr. Secretary, as we see powerful storms and more frequent flooding impacting our military installations, I'm concerned about the effects of climate change on our security and our readiness. We've already seen catastrophic flooding and wind damage at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska and Tyndall Air Force Base in my state of Florida. Many other facilities like MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa Bay near my district face similar risk. I wondered if you could talk about the threats posed by extreme weather events and what we are doing to respond to them.
Congressman, you gave 2 great examples of the effect. Offutt, Tyndall Air Force Base also. There are others, right, where we've seen the implications of more extreme weather. We are trying to take that into account in our plans to ensure that we are as resilient as possible. There are also other effects of climate change around the world, which will change geopolitical behaviors and patterns around the world that change our threat environment that we have to operate in. So there are a wide number of effects. So the department's very aware of this and is trying to plan for it as best as we possibly can.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Rogers and Mr. Aguilar, and then we'll end with Mr. Aderholt. Mr. Rogers.
Secretary Kendall, General Brown, General Raymond, thank you for your service to the country and for being here today with us. Since Putin put his finger on the nuclear button, has that changed our nuclear posture in any way?
Congressman, the short answer to your question is no. We have maintained a posture which we think is adequate given the threat situation. But we are being a great deal of attention to President Putin and the potential for something to happen there. It is a concern that you were watching. So, Kid, you want to add to that?
Our posture has not changed, and I'm very proud of our airmen and the work that they do day in and day out to ensure we maintain our nuclear posture. And then we'd also work that very closely with the United States Strategic Command as well as our Air Force Global Strike Command, which are the operational commanders that have that responsibility as we ensure that our airmen are organized, trained, and equipped to support our nuclear portfolio, make sure it's safe, secure, and reliable.
At what level of threat are we under now?
I mean, the way I would characterize this is we really have increased attention just based on the rhetoric that comes from President Putin and based on the current events. I would also offer that we do pay attention to ensure that we maintain our readiness, our not only our nuclear portfolio, but really across all of our portfolios. So increased awareness, and we're paying closer attention, particularly based on current events and how things are playing out for Mr. Putin in Ukraine.
Let me bring up the issue of JC2 modernization. As we see China and Russia both increase their missile stockpiles and advance hypersonic capabilities, I believe it's of the utmost importance that we're able to detect incoming threats before it's too late. Secretary Kendall, in your opening statement, you mentioned that the fiscal 23 budget provides for an interim airborne warning and control replacement. I'm glad to see that we're modernizing, but I worry about the word interim. What steps are being taken to ensure that this interim solution remains an interim solution?
There are two or three things in that question, Congressman. The E7 is an interim solution because we envision that at some point we're going to need something that is even more survivable than that. What the threat is doing for airborne surveillance is, and for any aircraft which performs that type of a mission, is trying to reach further out with lethal mechanisms that can defeat those. Traditionally, they survive to a large extent by standing off, being further away from the threat. China understands that and is trying to build systems that reach out further, and they're pretty far down that path. With regard to hypersonics, the critical issue there is missile attack warning. And we have capability now that can detect launches very well, and it does a very good job of tracking ballistic missiles. Hypersonic missiles are much more uncertain in their trajectories and are more difficult to track. So the new architecture that General Raymond has talked about is designed to do that mission from space. In general, we'd like to move towards space-based capabilities for surveillance against a variety of threats. That's the most efficient place for us to do it. It gives us global coverage. So if we can do it technically as well as have resilient architectures, then that's an ideal solution for us. And that's one of the reasons I used the word interim when I talked about the E7. General Raymond may want to say a little bit more about the hypersonics problem and what the new architecture will do for that.
I think you hit it right on the head, Mr. Secretary. The architecture that you'll see in this president's budget request does two things. One, it allows us to detect and track maneuverable hypersonics, which are more challenging today. And the second thing it does is it diversifies our architecture. Just like you diversify your financial portfolio, it builds resilience to a threat on orbit.
Are we able to keep up with the recent Chinese advances?
That's why we're here. I'm very comfortable that we are the world's best today, and I'm very comfortable that we have the team and with your support, the resources to be able to stay ahead of that threat. But there's work to be done, and we have to stay focused on that and move fast.
The Russians deployed hypersonics in Ukraine in the last few days. Did our current systems prove useful in that observation?
We have world coverage on being able to detect missiles. I can go into more details with you in the classified setting.
All right, thank you. Thanks, gentlemen, for your service.
Remember, we have about 5 votes pending shortly. Mr. Aguilar, then Mr. Adderholt, and Mr. Ryan has now joined us.
Mr. Secretary, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, you previously stated, I wanted to follow up on the hypersonic discussion. You previously stated that China has an asymmetric advantage over the U.S. in relations to hypersonics. And like you, I believe that we're crucial to invest in systems that we can compete with our peer and near-peer adversaries in. However, the air-launched rapid response weapon, the Air Force's hypersonic glide missile, has faced numerous challenges, including 3 launch test failures in 2021. And in the fiscal year 23 budget, the Air Force is only requesting RDT&E funding for this program. You've stated that you aren't satisfied with the pace. What's the long-term strategy for the Aero? And if we provide this funding this fiscal year, do you anticipate it being able to move into production in 24?
The Aero is one of our hypersonic programs. It's one of multiple programs we have in the Department of Defense. The program has not been successful in research and development so far. It has had, as you indicated, 3 flight test failures. So we want to see proof of success before we make a decision about commitment to production. So we're going to wait and see. The overall situation with regard to hypersonics, I think people are a little, it's more complex than people, I think, often understand. We don't want to mirror image the Chinese necessarily. They've invested heavily in hypersonics, and they've done some tests, including the one that was an orbital capability, basically, last fall. The U.S. has a different operational problem than China does. They're trying to keep our forces out of the region, and there's a target set that we present because of that to them. They present a different target set to us, and what we want to look at is what's the most cost-effective mix of weapons. There is certainly a role for hypersonics in that, and we need to invest in that and procure them in some quantities, but there's still an open question in my mind about what's the most cost-effective mix. Hypersonics has some attractive features, but they're also very expensive. People have asked me where we are relative to the Chinese. Basically, I think it's comparable from the point of view of technology. They have been very aggressive about boost glide vehicles and trying to move forward with those. We have been less aggressive, but I think in terms of our technological capabilities, comparable. We have had more success with air-breathing hypersonic weapons and the development of those, but it's still fairly early stages of development for those. So it's a fairly complicated picture, and we do need to get into some classified information to discuss it fully.
Yeah, I'm not interested in mimicking the Chinese. I'm just trying to understand the budgetary implications and the requests that you put before us, which include $115 million to continue testing in this respect. You're also requesting $634 million in hypersonic attack cruise missiles, which is a large increase over the $190 million provided in FY22. The Air Force spent a few $100 million on hypersonic prototyping program, HCSW or Hacksaw, only to end that effort. So, could you continue to expand? You've mentioned multiple layers. You've also mentioned we can go into other venues and talk about this, but from a budgetary perspective, can you give us your thoughts on what the priorities are for hypersonic and how do we continue to put money for research and to advance our interests without putting dollars into things that can't get to production?
Overall, what we need to get to with hypersonics is the ability to engage moving targets. And current systems are limited in that capability. They generally are designed for fixed targets. And there are some fixed targets that we might want hypersonics to attack cost effectively. But for the future, we want to get to another class of targets. And I can't really say very much more without getting to a classified session with you, Congressman.
Thank you. I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And reminding members, we have 5 votes currently on the floor, and we will be going into a classified briefing with the Secretary immediately after votes. So please, after the last of the 5 votes, go directly up if you're able to join us for that classified briefing. Mr. Aderholt and then Mr. Ryan. And Mr. Ryan, I will stay to make sure you can ask your question. Mr. Aderholt.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. In reviewing last year's Space Command basing decision to relocate Space Command headquarters to Huntsville, Alabama, the Inspector General ultimately found the basing decision, quote, complied with federal law and DOD policy and that the process was reasonable. Representing Northern Alabama, I can personally tell you that Huntsville does have a perfect combination for defense experts, businesses, skilled workers, educational opportunities, and quality of life that will help Space Command accelerate our nation's capabilities into the next generation. I look forward to seeing the GAO report when it's released, as I understand will be any day now. Mr. Secretary, let me address this question to you. Assuming for this question that the GAO report does not recommend overturning the original basing decision, can you briefly explain the process for reaffirming the basing decision and the timeline to stand up Space Command in Huntsville?
We're all hoping to move forward with the final decision as quickly as we can. We do need to see the final reports and assess those. And then the normal process at this point would be we have picked a preferred location and some acceptable alternatives, basically, a total of, I think, 6. And so we need to do under the NEPA process an evaluation of environmental impacts and so on, as well as look at some other considerations before we finalize the decision. Normally, that process would take on the order of 4 months total. There would be about 3 months of which we'd be doing the assessments and another month of public comment. So I'm very hopeful that one way or the other, we get a final decision within the next several months.
So what would be the actual timeline to stand up? What would be the actual timeline to stand up at Huntsville, assuming that it's not?
Oh, to stand up after the decision? I'd have to get you that for the record. I understand it requires a new building to be built for the headquarters, and there's a lot of lead time associated with that.
Okay. Oh, I see that the FY23 request seeks to cut more than 100 aircraft in order to focus on the Air Force modernization priorities. And I understand that and support your attempts to modernize U.S. Air Force to tomorrow's challenges, but concerned about the price in terms of aircraft and force structure that the budget proposes to pay to modernize. Furthermore, even while we modernize, we must stay laser focused on defending the homeland. That's a given. The National Guard and the Reserve have long been low-cost solutions for national defense. And in fact, the Air National Guard performs 93% of the Homeland Defense alert missions. My question, has the department made any attempts to seek cost savings by transferring force structure to the Air National Guard rather than eliminate it from the total force?
I'll let General Brown offer his views on that too. We look at force posture all the time, and we try to have a balance between the active, the Guard, and Reserve, which is sustainable over time, and which provides us the mix of immediately available capabilities and capabilities available on a slightly longer time frame to meet all our needs. You know, the role of the Guard, in particular in Homeland Defense, is really appreciated. That's a very cost-effective mission for the Guard. Thank you.
Congressman, we do a couple of things as we do our reviews. We look at the active Guard and Reserve mix, but we also look at our overseas and stateside mix to ensure we maintain a healthy force, because there is a dynamic to make sure we have the health of the force for all three components, active, Guard, and Reserve. And as we do that, I look at it from a total force perspective. And so our laydown is not just not just the Guard or not just the active duty or not just the Reserve. It's how we lay that out across to make sure we have the capability to do all the missions the nation's asked us to do. And Homeland Defense is a high priority for us, and you're right, the Guard does a outstanding job working Homeland Defense, and so they do play in our decision very highly as we lay out in this case, the fighter force structure across the United States Air Force.
Thank you. And I certainly think that is something that should be taken into consideration. Has the department considered accelerating modernization of the Air National Guard alert units out of the F-16 and F-15D airframes into the F-EX and the F-35 aircraft?
Gentlemen, if that's going to take more time than you have, please submit that for the record, but I'll extend it for another minute.
I think we need to take it for the record anyway.
Mr. Adelholt?
Okay, thank you.
I want to make sure you get a satisfactory answer.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Ryan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. I'll try to be brief here, knowing that the votes are going. Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you first for speaking with me recently about the 8 C-130Js that this committee appropriated specifically for the Air Force Reserve. And I've spoken with General Scobie, the Chief of the Air Force Reserve, many times over the years about these planes, which I fought very hard for, and which I'm very grateful for Chair McCollum and her staff for their diligence as well, and understanding of the need for helping our units upgrade from the H models to the J models. But I did want to note a couple of things as your team and the Air Force Reserve seek to finish the basing study that will ultimately determine where these planes go. Firstly, the subcommittee has twice passed report language to the Air Force Reserve that was written with these C-130Js in mind, and both the FY16 and FY17 HAC-D reports state in nearly identical language, quote, the Air Force Reserve includes units that have a designated specialized mission as well as a traditional tactical mission. And the committee encourages the Chief of the Air Force Reserve to review the requirements to ensure that specialized units are allocated equipment upgrades necessary to address safety concerns associated with these missions, end quote. So General Scobie, in testimony in 2019 before this subcommittee, said the following: our fundamental basis is going to be that we put those aircraft in our special missions, which include the firefighters and the aerial spray unit in Youngstown. So point number two is that under the prior administration, this basing study was already delayed once. It was put on ice after site visits, which you may know, after these site visits had already been completed at the aerial spray unit in Youngstown and the firefighting unit in Peterson, Colorado. So I want to urge you to use the work that has already been completed and complete this basing study in the most expeditious manner possible. And just want your assurances, Mr. Secretary, that the Air Force and the Air Force Reserve will complete a basing study whose criteria is in line with the criteria laid out by the subcommittee, and that is consistent with the past statements of the Chief of the Air Force Reserve, and that is completed as expeditiously as possible so that our pilots are not forced to fly older, less safe aircraft any longer than they already have to.
Councilman Ryan, we want to move forward and make those decisions as soon as we can, so I can certainly commit you to that. We're still in the early stages of that process, but we fully appreciate the importance of the special missions such as spraying and firefighting and even the Arctic mission we have. So the C-130s provide a variety of functions that are important to both to the department and to the country. So we're going to take that into account as we move forward through the basing process.
Great. Yeah, I mean, the base is not far from my house, and I talked to the pilots over there, and it's time for us to get moving on this. And I know the pandemic has contributed to a certain extent, but we seem to have the information we need. So I really appreciate it. And if you could just stay in touch with me on that. I have another question, Madam Chair. I'm going to submit for the record for General Brown on food transformation. General, I've been working on this for a long time, and as I stated to the panel that we had with the Secretary of Defense a few days ago, we also, the Appropriations Committee also funds VA Health, and the high rates of diabetes, the higher rates of obesity is driving up healthcare costs both for active duty and for our veterans. And it's something that I think can ties directly back to the issues around food. So I want to submit a question on food transformation and kind of engage on, some of the changes that we've been pushing for. But I appreciate that. And Madam Chair, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I appreciate that, Mr. Ryan. Mr. Calvert, as we wind up, I have some questions for the record that I will be submitting besides some technical questions staff have on the Arctic. Hypersonics, we'll talk about that a little more classified. The block upgrade that you were talking about with the F-35s, other things related to the F-35s and nuclear modernization. Mr. Calvert, anything before I adjourn?
Just that I also will have some questions for the record, and when we get into the classified session, I want to obviously get into the hypersonic issue in more detail, so I look forward to doing that. Thank you.
And members, the few remaining, I'll just remind again, immediately after the fifth vote, we will go up into classified session within the Capitol. Once again, I want to thank Secretary Kendall, General Brown, and General Raymond for being here today. Please, once again, thank all those who serve alongside of you, those who wear uniforms and those who come to work wearing civilian clothes. They all play an important role in our national security. With that, that concludes today's hearing. This subcommittee now stands adjourned.